So picture this. It's August 1947. One of the oldest civilizations on Earth is about to be reborn as a brand new, independent nation. But this wasn't some easy, clean break. Nope, it happened in the middle of absolute chaos, deep division, and just massive uncertainty. This is the incredible story of how modern India was forged from a set of challenges that, honestly, seemed impossible.
So, how on earth did they pull this off? Well, to really get it, we've got to start with the sheer scale of the problems India was handed. Then we'll dive into the amazingly audacious plan its leaders came up with to build a unified nation, pretty much from scratch. So let's start with that impossible inheritance.
You know, the moment the clock struck midnight and India became independent, it was immediately slammed with a series of massive crises that needed answers like yesterday. There was literally no time to celebrate.
First up, an almost unimaginable human catastrophe. See, the British exit triggered the partition of the subcontinent, which created the new nation of Pakistan. And in the violence and chaos that followed, 8 million refugees fled their homes and poured into India. Just think about that. They showed up with nothing and needed homes, food, and jobs right now.
And if that wasn't a big enough problem, there was this huge political puzzle. The map of India wasn't one solid country. Not at all. It was this messy patchwork of land the British had ruled directly, plus almost 500 independent princely states. And each one of these was run by its own king, who now had to be talked into giving up centuries of power to join this new thing called India.
So, once they started tackling those immediate fires, India's leaders had to face an even bigger, more complicated puzzle. How do you possibly unite a population that's so deeply divided and so incredibly poor into a single functioning country? I mean, the sheer scale of this task was just mind-boggling. We're talking about a population of 345 million people. To put that in perspective, that was more than the United States and the Soviet Union combined at the time. How do you even begin to make that many people, who have so little in common, feel like they're all part of the same team?
And look, this wasn't some uniform group of people. The population was crisscrossed by these deep historical divides. You had the ancient caste system, which locked people into rigid social hierarchies. You had religious divisions between the Hindu majority and millions of Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, and others. And on top of all that, you had hundreds of different languages, totally different ways of dressing, eating, you name it.
And if trying to unite everyone wasn't hard enough, you had the massive problem of development. The vast majority of Indians were just desperately poor. Most were farmers in villages whose lives depended entirely on the monsoon rains. And in the cities, workers were crammed into slums with basically no access to things like education or healthcare.
So this was the fundamental question, right? How do you take this enormous, diverse, divided, and struggling population and somehow forge a single, stable country where everyone can live together? How do you create unity and progress at the very same time?
Well, the answer was to create a blueprint, a really bold, ambitious, and incredibly detailed plan for the future. And this wasn't some idea scribbled on the back of a napkin. It was a document that was carefully debated and hammered out over 3 long years by people from every single corner of the country.
So here's the play-by-play. For nearly 3 years, from late 1946 all the way to late 1949, about 300 Indians from all different backgrounds met in New Delhi. Their monumental task was to debate and write a constitution from the ground up. And all that work led to the Indian Constitution, which officially went into effect on January 26, 1950, a day that's now celebrated as India's Republic Day.
But this constitution was so much more than just a rule book. It was a radical vision for a totally new kind of nation. And at its heart were 2 truly revolutionary ideas that were designed to tackle those huge problems of division and inequality head-on.
Okay, so the first big idea was something that was genuinely radical for the time: universal adult franchise. This meant that every single Indian citizen over the age of 21, man or woman, rich or poor, educated or not, was given the right to vote from day one.
Now, to really appreciate how wild this was, you've got to look at the so-called established democracies, like the UK and the US. There, the right to vote was won through these long, painful struggles over generations. First, it was only men with property, then maybe educated men. Women had to fight for decades more. India just did it, gave the vote to every single adult, all at once, in one bold move.
The second revolutionary idea took direct aim at that massive problem of social division. The Constitution guaranteed absolute equality before the law for every single citizen, no matter what their caste or religion was. This was a direct assault on centuries of social hierarchy.
So this is a really crucial point. India made a very deliberate choice to be a secular nation. Now, some people wanted India to be a Hindu state, kind of like a mirror image of Pakistan's identity as a Muslim state. But India's first Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, was absolutely firm on this. He said that India could not and must not go down that road.
So what did that actually mean on the ground? It meant that India's large minority communities, we're talking Muslims, Sikhs, Christians, Parsis, Jains, and others, were guaranteed the exact same legal rights as the Hindu majority, the same access to government jobs, the same protections under the law, the whole shebang.
You know, when you step back and look at the big picture, it's pretty incredible. Faced with partition, a refugee crisis, crushing poverty, and these incredibly deep social divisions, India's founders didn't panic. They responded with a clear, audacious, and profoundly hopeful blueprint for a unified, democratic, and secular nation.
So the Constitution provided the vision, right? It was the blueprint for the nation. But a blueprint isn't the building. It was just the very beginning of this massive experiment. The real challenge, the one that's still going on today, has been putting those incredible ideals into practice. And that leaves us with a pretty big question. How has that great Indian experiment actually unfolded since 1950?
Today, we're going to look at one of the most ambitious projects in modern history. We're talking about the foundational blueprint of India, its constitution. Let's dive right in. Just think about that for a second. After centuries of colonial rule, with incredible diversity and some really deep social divisions, a brand new, independent India had to answer this huge question. And the answer they came up with, well, it wasn't just some dry legal document, it was a vision for a whole new kind of society.
So here's our plan. We'll start with the sheer scale of the mission, then we'll look at 3 key pillars they built: security for everyone, trying to repair a fractured society, and balancing power. And then we'll see how this blueprint is still very much a living thing today.
All right, let's start with Section 1, Architecting a New Nation. Picture it. It's 1947. The British have just left, and the Constituent Assembly is facing a job that seems, honestly, almost impossible. How do you forge a single, unified country from this incredible tapestry of different languages, religions, and cultures?
And this is absolutely the key thing to understand. The people writing this constitution weren't just making a rule book. They were trying to perform a kind of social engineering, actively designing a framework to solve the biggest, most painful problems the new nation was up against. Which brings us to the first huge pillar they had to build: guaranteeing security for all. You know, after the horrific violence of partition, one question was on everyone's mind. What was going to happen to the millions of Muslims who chose to stay in India?
Remember, the subcontinent had just been violently split along religious lines, creating Pakistan. So for the huge Muslim minority still in India, the future felt incredibly uncertain, even scary. Their safety wasn't just a practical issue, it was a real test of what kind of country India was going to be.
And you can really hear the conviction in the words of leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru. He basically argued that no matter what, India had to be a democratic state that protected its people. This wasn't just some nice idea. It was a fundamental commitment to secularism, making it crystal clear that your rights as a citizen had nothing to do with your religion.
Now let's move on to our second pillar. Because beyond the religious divisions, the architects had to face another, much older social structure that had split society for centuries: the caste system. This was all about trying to right some major historical wrongs.
And at the very bottom of this system was the practice of untouchability. The Constitution's framers themselves called it a slur and a blot on India. It was a system of total social insulation, and they knew for India to truly be a free nation, this had to go.
So what did they do? They took direct, decisive action. The Constitution made the practice of untouchability completely illegal. And then, in a hugely symbolic and practical move, it said that all Hindu temples, which had been closed off to the lowest castes for ages, had to be open to everyone. But they also knew that just banning something on paper isn't enough to fix the damage. To really make amends, they created one of the world's most extensive affirmative action programs. This meant reserving a certain number of seats in legislatures and jobs in the government for the scheduled castes, the former untouchables, and also for the Adivasis, or scheduled tribes, who had also been pushed to the margins for centuries.
Now, this wasn't an easy decision that everyone agreed on. There were people in the assembly who argued that candidates from these communities, also called Harijans, just weren't qualified for top government jobs. But that argument was met with an absolutely devastating response from a member named H.J. Kandekar.
And his words just cut right to the heart of the issue.
He basically turned to his more privileged colleagues and said, "You are the reason for our condition. You suppressed us for thousands of years." From that perspective, the reservation system wasn't some kind of charity. It was a necessary first step to start repairing millennia of systemic injustice.
Okay, so you've got these incredible pillars in place for religious security and social justice. But what kind of structure is going to hold it all together? This brings us to pillar number 3, balancing national and state power in a country this massive and diverse.
So inside the Constituent Assembly, a huge debate broke out. On one side, you had people arguing for a really powerful central government. They believed it was the only way to plan for the whole country and keep it unified. But on the other side, people were worried that all the power would just end up in Delhi, and that the states or provinces needed the freedom to actually govern their own people.
So how do you solve that? Do you go with one or the other? Well, they came up with something really clever instead, an elegant compromise, a system of 3 lists to divide up the powers of government.
It's actually pretty brilliant. First, you have the union list. These are things only the central government can handle, big picture stuff like taxes, defense, foreign policy. Then there's the state list, for things the states are mainly in charge of, like education and health. And finally, there's a concurrent list, for things like forests and agriculture, where both the center and the states can make laws. It was a masterclass in finding a balance.
And all of this brings us to our final section, the living blueprint. Because the whole point of this exercise wasn't to create a historical document to be put in a museum. It was designed from day one to be a foundation for the future.
So if you take away one thing, it's this. Those 3 pillars we just looked at, a secular state for security, affirmative action for justice, and that federal balance of power, they weren't just quick fixes for the problems of 1950. They are the very ideas that continue to be debated, fought over, and defended in India's incredibly vibrant democracy right now, today.
And that leaves us with a final question to chew on. The architects of the Constitution gave India a blueprint for equality and for unity. But a blueprint is just the beginning, right? The real, never-ending challenge for any country is how you keep building on that foundation day after day to try and actually live up to those ideals you started with.
Okay, just picture this for a second. You've just won your independence, and now you have to write a single rulebook for one of the most diverse, most complex nations on the entire planet. Well, that was the incredible challenge facing India's Constitution Assembly, so let's dive into how they pulled it off. I mean, really think about that. How do you do it? This wasn't just about putting laws on paper. No, this was about creating a single, unified identity from this incredible mix of languages, cultures, and social classes. Where would you even begin? Well, one of the very first hurdles they faced was a huge one. It was an issue that genuinely threatened to tear the brand new nation apart before it even got on its feet. And it all came down to one simple question. What language should India speak?
The debate was intense, and the assembly was basically split right down the middle. On one side, you had a lot of members who believed that English, the language of the colonial rulers, just had to go. They argued that Hindi should be the national language to really build a unified Indian identity. But on the other side, especially in the South, millions of people didn't speak Hindi. And to them, this felt like one part of the country forcing its language and its culture on everybody else.
And listen, this was not just some polite debate. It was serious. T.T. Krishnamachari, one of the assembly members, stood up and gave this incredibly stark warning. He basically said that people in the South were ready to secede, to actually break away from India, if Hindi was forced on them. The threat of the country fracturing was very, very real.
So, what do? Well, they found a way through it with a really clever compromise. They decided that Hindi would be the official language, which satisfied one side, but English would continue to be used for all the important stuff, like in the courts, government services, and for communication between states. It was this really practical solution that calmed everything down and, honestly, kept the country in one piece.
Now let's shift gears from that specific debate to the person who had the master vision for the entire document. Because while hundreds of people contributed, one figure was absolutely central, the chairman of the drafting committee, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. So, who was Dr. Ambedkar? Well, he was known respectfully as Baba Saheb, and he was so much more than a politician. He was a brilliant lawyer, a sharp economist, and, this is absolutely crucial, he was a leader of the Dalit community, the group once called untouchables. His personal experience with deep-seated inequality profoundly shaped his vision for India. It's no wonder he's called the father of the Indian Constitution. So as all this work was wrapping up, Dr. Ambedkar gave one last powerful speech to the assembly. But he wasn't just taking a victory lap. He was looking forward, into the future. And he delivered a pretty serious warning about a fundamental problem he saw at the very heart of the new India. He said, and this is a direct quote, that India was about to enter into a life of contradictions. Wow. What a phrase, right? A life of contradictions. What in the world did he mean by that? For Dr. Ambedkar, the contradiction was this: giving every single citizen the right to vote, what he called political democracy, was a fantastic first step, but it just wasn't enough. He argued that it was almost meaningless if you didn't also have real social and economic democracy to go along with it. And this slide breaks it down perfectly. In political life, the Constitution created equality. It's the principle of one man, one vote, one value. Simple, fair. But in social and economic life, total inequality. The structure of society itself, he argued, would continue to deny that very same principle of one man, one value. And here it is, in his own powerful words. He's saying that the very framework of society, the deep-rooted caste and class structures, was built on inequality. So a piece of paper, the Constitution, could declare everyone equal, but it couldn't just magically erase a system that for centuries had treated people as anything but equal. He gave that speech way back in 1949, and it really leaves us with a huge question, one that's just as relevant now as it was then. He pointed out this fundamental tension, this contradiction between political equality on paper and social inequality in real life. So we have to ask ourselves, all these decades later, does that life of contradictions still exist today? You know, when you look at a map, the borders can feel so permanent, almost like they were carved by nature. But the internal map of modern India, the one that defines all its states, that wasn't drawn by mountains or rivers. Nope. It was drawn through decades of passionate and sometimes really tragic political struggle. Let's get into the incredible story of how language literally redrew the map of an entire nation. So just try to picture this for a second. It's 1947. You've just gained independence. How in the world do you even begin to organize a country of this size with this incredible diversity of languages, of cultures? I mean, this was the monumental, almost impossible question facing India's first leaders. And this is what they were starting with. Just look at it. It's a complicated, messy patchwork of provinces ruled directly by the British, mixed in with hundreds of semi-independent princely states. It was basically an administrative puzzle left over from centuries of different rulers. The task of creating one single coherent nation out of all this, it was just immense. Okay, so at the very heart of this whole challenge was this fundamental conflict, right? It was a clash between a promise made years ago during the freedom struggle and a deep-seated fear that cropped up right after independence. And this tension, this is what would define the entire debate. So let's start with a promise. Way back in the 1920s, the Indian National Congress, that's the main party that was fighting for freedom, had made this really powerful commitment. They said once India is independent, each major language group is going to get its own province, its own state. So what even is a linguistic state? Well, the idea is actually pretty simple, but it's also kind of revolutionary. It just means that the lines on the map, the administrative boundaries, should match up with where people speak a common language. The goal was to give them a shared cultural and political home. But then came the problem, a huge one. Independence in 1947 came with the absolute trauma of partition. The country had been literally torn in two based on religion, and it led to just unimaginable violence. So now, the leadership is looking at this idea of dividing the country again, but this time by language. And they were terrified. They feared it would lead to the exact same result, the whole country just disintegrating. And this right here, this quote really shows you the official mindset. Prime Minister Nehru, who had actually supported the idea before, now saw this whole push for linguistic states as a disruptionist tendency. For him, the number one priority, above all else, was keeping the fragile new nation strong and united. And his number two, Deputy Prime Minister Vallabhbhai Patel, he put it even more bluntly. He said the first and last need of India was to become a single nation. Basically, anything that got in the way of that goal, including that old promise of linguistic states, had to go. The leadership had completely slammed the door on the idea. But here's the thing. The people hadn't forgotten the promise. And this is where the story shifts from these high-level political debates to a really powerful grassroots movement. A movement that was driven by this deep, deep hunger for recognition and a state to finally call their own. Now, even though this pressure was building all over the country, the loudest calls were coming from Telugu speakers down in the Madras presidency. When Prime Minister Nehru visited in 1952, he wasn't met with cheers. He was met with black flags and one singular unified demand: we want Andhra. And this is the man who would become the face of that entire struggle, Poti Srimamalu. Now, he was a veteran follower of Mahatma Gandhi, and what that means is his actions carried this immense moral weight. He decided he had to do something drastic to force the government to listen. In October of 1952, Sri Amulu began a hunger strike, a fast unto death, and it would last for 58 days. 58! As the fast went on, support just swelled. You had strikes and protests that were paralyzing towns all across the region. The whole country was watching, just holding its breath. And then the unthinkable happened. On December 15th, 1952, after 58 days without any food, Poti Srimamalu died. The news, as one newspaper put it, engulfed entire Andhra in chaos. The protest became so intense, so widespread, that the central government just could not ignore the demand any longer. Their hand was forced. Sri Ramalu's tragic death was a massive turning point. It completely broke the political stalemate, and it set this powerful precedent, one that would kick off a chain reaction across the entire country. And so, on October 1st, 1953, born from all that protest and sacrifice, the new state of Andhra officially came into being. It was the very first linguistic state in independent India. Well, the creation of Andhra basically opened the floodgates. It was like a domino effect. All of a sudden, Kannada speakers, Malayalam speakers, Marathi speakers, they all intensified their demands for their own states. The government realized it couldn't keep dealing with this one by one, so they set up a states reorganization commission to come up with a plan for the whole country. And the work this commission did, well, it would lead to the single biggest redrawing of India's entire map in its entire history. So let's really look at this transformation. Remember this map? This is where we started back in 1947, a chaotic mix of British territories and all those princely states. Now, by the early 1950s, the princely states had been absorbed, but the old kind of illogical boundaries were still mostly there. You can see Andhra has been carved out, right? But much of the rest of the map is still a holdover from the past. And here it is, the result. By 1975, a nation completely redrawn. The new state lines pretty much follow the linguistic contours of the country. And here's the really crucial part. That fear, that big fear of disintegration, it never happened. In fact, you could argue the opposite happened. By giving political space to these linguistic identities, the Indian Union was actually strengthened. It created a much more stable and representative country. This timeline just gives you a quick recap of that incredible period of change. It all started with Andhra in 53. That was followed by the massive reorganization across the whole country in 56. Then you had the division of Bombay State for Marathi and Gujarati speakers in 1960, and finally the division of Punjab in 1966. Which kind of leaves us with one final thought. The story of India's map isn't just about lines and borders, is it? It's really about recognizing and giving political expression to all the diverse identities that exist within a single nation. It makes you wonder, right? How much of who we think we are is shaped by the maps we live inside?
All right, let's get right into it. Picture this. It's 1947. India is a brand new, independent nation, and it is facing a challenge of, well, epic proportions. I mean, how do you even begin to plan the future for hundreds of millions of people? India's answer was something truly massive, a grand design known as the 5-year plans.
And the goal here was just monumental. The country's new leaders were staring down two huge tasks. First, they had to figure out how to lift this enormous population out of really deep poverty. And second, they had to build a modern industrial base, basically from scratch. This wasn't just about making a few changes. It was about building a whole new economic reality.
So that's the big question, isn't it? When you're starting from square one, where do you go? Do you just let the free market do its thing, or does the government need to take the wheel and control everything? India's leaders had to come up with an answer, and they had to do it fast.
What they landed on was a kind of middle path. In 1950, they set up what was called a planning commission, and the big idea was a mixed economy. This wasn't pure capitalism, and it wasn't pure socialism either. The thinking was that both the government, the state, and private businesses had really important and complementary jobs to do.
And they split the work up pretty neatly. The Planning Commission decided that the state would handle all the really heavy lifting, developing huge industries like steel and building massive infrastructure projects. The private sector's job then was to kind of fill in the gaps, to boost production in other areas, and, this is a big one, create jobs for millions of people.
So, how do you manage a national project that's this ambitious? Well, you break it down into chunks. And for India's planners, the magic number was 5. The entire economic blueprint for the country was built around these huge, all-in 5-year plans. That number, 5, would set the pace for India's development for decades to come. And they didn't waste any time. The Planning Commission gets set up in 1950. Just a few years later, in 1956, they kick off the second 5-year plan, which was a real game changer with its focus on industry. And by the end of the decade, you could actually see the results on the ground. Massive projects like the Bhilai steel plant and the Gandhi Sagar Dam were becoming a reality.
Which brings us to what these plans actually looked like in the real world. I mean, these weren't just policies written on paper. No, they were turning into concrete and steel, literally changing the landscape of the nation. People started calling them the new temples of modern India.
That second 5-year plan especially really set the stage. The focus was totally laser-sharp: develop heavy industry, build gigantic dams. And the key thing here, all of these crucial sectors were going to be under the direct control of the state. It was a very clear top-down vision for how to modernize a country.
But, for the Prime Minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, this was about so much more than just hitting production targets. He really saw this as a great national adventure. He called it a mighty cooperative effort. He desperately wanted every single Indian to feel like they were a partner in this, like they were all building this new nation together.
And you can really see that vision taking shape in projects just like these. Take the Bhilai steel plant. It was built with help from the Soviet Union, right in the middle of a rural area. It became this incredible symbol of progress. Same with the Gandhi Sagar Dam, just a massive feat of engineering, designed to tame rivers and generate power. These were the real, tangible results of those 5-year plans.
But, as you can probably guess, this whole top-down, hyper-focused approach, well, not everyone was on board. While some people were celebrating these brand new dams and factories, there were other voices, quieter ones, that started raising some pretty serious questions about the path India was on.
See, this approach kicked off a huge debate pretty much right away. Critics brought up some major points. Some people argued that by focusing so heavily on industry, they were forgetting about agriculture, which was, the backbone of the entire economy. Others pointed to a huge hole in the plan. What about primary education? And a third group made a point that was way ahead of its time, that these plans were completely ignoring what all this rapid industrialization would do to the environment.
And you just have to listen to this incredible warning from Mira Ben, who was a follower of Mahatma Gandhi. She wrote this all the way back in 1949. She warned that, science and machinery might give you huge results for a little while, but if you don't respect nature's balance, what you'll get in the end is desolation. It's such a powerful challenge to that whole idea of progress at any cost.
So what does this all mean? Where do we land? Well, the 5-year plans weren't some simple success story, but they weren't a simple failure either. What they left behind is a really complicated legacy, and they started a debate that, honestly, is still going on today.
So you really have these two competing ideas, side by side. On the one hand, you've got this incredible vision of progress, dams and steel plants as the symbols of a new, strong nation, all built by people working together. And on the other hand, you have this warning voice saying, hold on, this kind of progress has a huge cost. A cost to the environment, a cost to other parts of the economy, a cost for ignoring the laws of nature.
And so this whole story leaves us with one massive, lingering question. It's the same question Mira Ben was asking more than 70 years ago, and it's one that pretty much every country on the planet is still trying to figure out. How do you balance that real, urgent need for economic development with the just as urgent need to protect our planet and take care of our people? That's the enduring challenge and the legacy of India's grand experiment.
When India finally became a free nation back in 1947, it set some incredibly high ideals for itself. So today, we're going to open up the history books and put together a kind of 60-year report card. Let's dive in and see how the promise of this new nation actually measured up against the progress it made.
To really get a grip on India's journey, we've got to start with this question. Because when India was born, the world it stepped into was anything but simple.
I mean, it was a world just coming out of one massive war and immediately diving headfirst into a whole different kind of conflict. And that conflict, of course, was the Cold War. So newly independent India finds itself on this global stage that's just dominated by this intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yeah, not exactly a calm start for a new country. This timeline really paints a picture of the wild world India was born into. Just look at this. Right after 1945, the UN is just getting on its feet, the old colonial empires are falling apart, and then, boom, the world splits into two hostile camps led by the USA and the USSR, and everyone was getting pressured to pick a side. So what's a new nation like India supposed to do? Well, its first prime minister, Jawaharlal Nehru, who was also the foreign minister, he decided on this really unique and, frankly, brave path. He said India would not pick a side. Now, for a new, vulnerable country, that was a pretty radical idea, and this policy became known as non-alignment. And this wasn't just an idea for India. It actually sparked a whole global movement. You had leaders from all over the newly independent world joining together, creating this powerful third option that basically told other countries, hey, you don't have to join this superpower rivalry. You can forge your own destiny. Okay, so here's the crucial point, and it's something a lot of people misunderstand. Non-alignment did not mean isolation. It wasn't about hiding from the world. It was the complete opposite. It was this active policy of getting involved, of trying to mediate between the American and Soviet alliances, and taking a moral stand to try and prevent another war. All right, so that was India's game plan for dealing with the rest of the world. But what about its plan for itself? Let's switch gears and look at the incredible promises India made to its own people, written right into its founding document, the Constitution. And this was the blueprint. The goal was a single, united country that was also democratic and secular. A nation where every single citizen was equal in the eyes of the law, with a free press and an independent judiciary to back it all up. That is a truly ambitious vision, especially for a brand new nation. So the promises were made, right? The ideals were all set in stone. Now, let's fast forward 60 years to 2007 and see, how did the country actually do? It's time to grade that report card. Okay, on the achievement side, the results are pretty amazing, especially when you think about what people were predicting. A lot of foreign observers were totally convinced India would just break apart or fall under military rule. But it didn't. It stayed together. I mean, think about it. 13 massive general elections, hundreds of state and local ones, a free press that often criticized the government, and courts that stayed independent. All this in one of the most diverse places on the planet. By any measure, that's a huge win. But that's only half the story, because while that political framework held up, some deep cracks in the social fabric were still there. And this is the other side of the report card, the part of the promise that remains unfinished. And these weren't small problems. Despite the Constitution guaranteeing equality, these divisions were deep. The Dalit community, formerly known as untouchables, they kept facing systemic violence and discrimination in their daily lives. The whole idea of a secular nation was constantly tested by violent clashes between different religious groups. But the source material really points to one challenge that has just grown and grown, the massive widening gap between the rich and the poor. And this isn't just an opinion, right? This is a stark observation from the historical record. This growing economic divide became one of the biggest failures in living up to that founding ideal of equality for everyone. And you can literally see this contrast in India's cities. Economic development created some incredible wealth. Huge houses, fancy restaurants, private schools for some. But right next door, millions of people are still living in these sprawling slums, unable to even afford the basics. This quote just hits the nail on the head, doesn't it? It perfectly captures the core issue. The law on paper can promise equality for all, but the reality on the ground, well, it's a very different story. For so many, that constitutional promise hasn't yet translated into their actual lived experience. So, after 60 years, what's the final verdict? Well, this is probably the most honest way to put it. India's journey is this story of incredible successes right alongside profound failures. It's a really complex picture of promises that were kept and promises that are still very much unfulfilled. Which leaves us with this final thought. The story of India is just such a powerful reminder that building a nation isn't a one-and-done thing. It's a continuous process. And the central challenge, not just for India, but for so many countries, is still trying to close that huge gap between the ideals we write down and the reality we live every single